Hi, it's Pastor Andy with our discipleship video today. And the title might throw you off a little bit. You might look at this title and say, well, what do you mean? It would make more sense if you said a vision of the future or maybe seeing the future or something similar. And the problem with that is that this week and for the videos this week, I am talking about a future, but very little of what I'm talking about is our future. It was the future to the prophet Daniel, but it is a part of our history. So today and Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about things that happened decades and centuries before the life of Jesus. So again, they truly are history to us, but for Daniel, he was given a glimpse into the future. And like some other prophecies that may seem vague at first, but they turn out to be pretty accurate or very accurate. Wow. Daniel, in what is for us, Daniel chapter 11, is exactly the way history unfolded. So let's take a look. In my Bible, the heading for Daniel chapter 11 is simply the kings of the south and the north. Now, that's a rather innocuous type of statement, and it really doesn't lead to any real sense that what we're about to see is prophecy, or it certainly doesn't give any indication as to how provable the words of Daniel chapter 11 were going to be. This message, by the way, was interpreted by an angel, and that angel most likely was Gabriel, as we see in Daniel chapter 10, verse 21. Now, Daniel 11:2 kind of continues the overall vision, but this is where we pick up the story. And when I say story, I say that because this is history to us. And if we go through a historical timeline or a history book, we will see this play out exactly as it happens. It mentions three more kings. Verse 2 says, "And I will show you the truth. Behold, three more kings shall arise in Persia." These three kings are lumped together, and then a fourth king will come who is richer than those before him. Now, the king at the time that this was happening was Cyrus. We find that in chapter 10, verse 1, and that he reigned, given the time frame that Daniel says this vision happened, this was approximately 538 BC. And history shows that the rich king, who more rich than the others, far richer than the others before him, was Xerxes, who reigned from approximately 486 to 465 BC. What history tells us, not the Bible, what history tells us is that there were three kings that reigned in Persia over the Persian Empire between Cyrus and Xerxes. Those were, I may not pronounce this first one right, but Camses from 530 to 522, Smerdis in 522, and then Darius the First from 522 to 486. Well, that's pretty accurate so far as prophecy. Then in verse 3, it mentions a mighty king. Now, no king in history, we have to jump forward about 100 or so years, a little bit more than 100 years, but no king in history during that time period was more powerful than Alexander. And specifically, I mean Alexander the Great. But as further proof that what he's talking about is Alexander the Great, we see that this great king's kingdom is going to be broken into four different pieces. And we know that after Alexander died in 323 BC, which is just 8 years after he conquered Persia, that his kingdoms were split into four different kingdoms. And verse 4 provides us a little bit more detail into that division. The ESV says that the division would not go to his posterity. Well, what does that mean? It means his descendants would not be king. Well, what does history tell us? History tells us that Alexander had two sons, and both of them were murdered. And so the commanders of his army took charge of the four different regions that had made up the Greek Empire up to that point, and the strength of that empire was never the same after Alexander's death. Verse 5 then turns to two of those divisions. One would consist of Egypt, which is under Ptolemy or the Ptolemaic Empire, and the other was under Syria, or the Seleucid Empire, named after Seleucus. Now, eventually, the death of these first set of rulers would lead to the two kingdoms making an alliance from the daughter of Ptolemy. Well, verse 6 says that after some years they made an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, that would be Egypt, shall come to the king of the north, Syria, to make an agreement. But, verse 6 continues, she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. Well, what does that mean? Well, in this case, the word arm is being used as an heir. So her heir and his heir would not continue to be the king. She would die, he would die, the king and queen, and the son would also die. Well, did that happen? Well, history tells us, her name was Bernice, by the way, history tells us that she was the second wife of this king. And the first wife got a little jealous. And so the first wife had the king and his wife and their newborn child killed. Again, we see a preview in Daniel 11 of exactly what unfolded in history. Verse 7 then indicates the response from everything that is happening here, because the daughter that was given, remember, was from one king to the other. Now she's dead, so the brother of the daughter who was killed, the daughter being the second wife, hope that follows, the brother of that bride who had been killed then attacked Syria. He plundered the country, mentions that in verse 8, and over time a treaty was struck between the two countries. Now, that's just the first part. We're kind of setting this up, and we're going to spend less time on individual verses next week, kind of jumping, or I'm sorry, not next week, on Wednesday, jumping a little bit further into this to see how all of this plays up to Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and how that led to a resurgence of Jerusalem and Judaism, and ultimately led to the King of Kings, and that being Jesus. So check back Wednesday for the rest of this story of Daniel chapter 11.